as soon as she arrives. Welcome and thank you for coming. This evening's event was billed as very much a discussion about Brexit, but given the tragic events in Brussels earlier this week, we will be taking that into the kind of wider conversation about Europe. Just so I will hand you over in a second to Gavin Hewitt, who is the chief correspondent for the BBC and was until very recently the Europe editor. He's going to chair tonight's conversation. But before I do that, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, I'm sure you'll have lots. If you can wait for the microphone that I'll be bringing round to you. So I will hand over to Gavin.
Thank you very much. Just ensuring my phone is off before we begin this event. As Millicent was saying, the idea originally was to focus very much upon Brexit and what Brexit would mean for Europe. And I think our discussion tonight is going to be more about the impact of these recent events in Brussels, not just upon what potential impact they may have on Brexit, but more also upon the whole idea of Europe and this succession of crises which has been hitting Europe in recent times. Now, just to go through the kind of methodology of the evening, what we're going to do is we're going to have a brief comment from all of us on this panel, then a discussion for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions, and the discussion will continue. And I will try and ensure that neither the questions nor what we say here on this panel goes on too long. But let me just, we've got one of the panelists who's not here, which is Natalie Nugara from The Guardian. So she's not here yet, but let me just introduce, there's Annalisa Pires, who's a journalist, producer, and director, and she wrote, directed, and produced something which you may well have seen, the great European disaster movie. And then to her right is Joris Judendijk, is the author of Swimming with Sharks, My Journey into the World of Bankers. And next to me is Toby Young, columnist, associate editor of The Spectator, and author of How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, which is no doubt essential reading in the European Commission at the moment. Let me just say a few words, and then we might as well begin this discussion, and then when Natalie arrives, that she can join us. It wasn't so long ago that the mood in Europe and amongst the European institutions was bullish. I can actually remember an internal strategy paper which opened with the words, "Europe has never been so prosperous, so secure, nor so free." The American investor Warren Buffett once said, "It is only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked." What's been happening in the time that I've been most associated with Europe is that it's been a period when Europe has had to face up, to an extent, to some of its own illusions. Firstly, over the Eurozone crisis. Europe discovered that the system that it built could not sustain the financial crisis that began in 2008, and then spent the best part of 4 years trying to come up with a new system that would ensure the success of monetary union. And that's very much a work still in process. And the same you could almost detect with the refugee crisis. What the refugee crisis has done is to focus in on Schengen, whether the passport-free area works, or whether indeed it can't work unless you change the way Europe's external borders are patrolled or looked after. But it's not just the commentators who I think perhaps their analysis has changed. I'm just going to give you the words of Manuel Valls, the French Prime Minister, who warned recently, Europe could lose its historical footing and the project could die quickly. Things could fall apart in months. And in this climate of insecurity, it is when Britain is going to decide whether it stays or goes. And as far as the European establishment is concerned, and I'm thinking here of people in the Commission like Jean-Claude Juncker, he believes, and he's quite open about this, that if the UK were to leave, it could lead to the unravelling of the EU. And it's a view shared by, I think, the Italian finance minister, who believes that the very process of what's going on here could lead to a destabilising of a further destabilising of the EU. And then, of course, we've got the a somewhat remarkable development. In order to try and find a way out of the refugee crisis, Europe has placed a very big bet on the president of Turkey, Mr. Erdogan. All of those things will probably feed into our conversation today. But look, I'm going to try and keep everybody to time, so I'll stay to time myself. Joris, why don't you start, and let's just begin on some of these events that have happened in Brussels. What impact do you see what's happened in the last few days having, first of all, on Europe and the general feeling about the idea of Europe, and then perhaps also about the debate in this country?
Well, I think the events in Brussels and just the string of terrorist attacks, they're part of what is called a crisis. But I think if you look at the medical term, in medicine, a crisis is when the patient either dies or recovers. And so it's a tipping point. And I think terrorism and refugees and the Euro mess, they are actually chronic problems. But together they form a crisis, which is going to be, I think, the tipping point for Europe. Because for the past 60 years, they've been building something, basically running away from Auschwitz. They didn't really know where they were going. They called it ever closer union. And it was always presented as there's no alternative. That's why the major opposition now in Germany is called Alternative für Deutschland, alternatives for Germany. And so I think we're at this really interesting point when I think indeed, as you said, it's either going to fall apart or we're going to build something new. But it will have to be qualitatively new. It will have to involve a real democratic Europe. And I think for that, we can't use the English. And so that's why I'm in favor of Brexit. Because I think the heart of the English was never in it anyway. And so they're going to keep on sabotaging it from the inside. And so I'd rather have them on the outside.
And do you think, just before I bring in Annalisa into this, do you think that what happened in Brussels this week leads to further kind of decay of the European idea? Do you think that?
Not necessarily decay. I think what's been happening is that we have these half-hearted measures like Schengen or like the Euro, fair weather institutions, and then there's a crisis, and the only way is forward, and which is then presented as a fait accompli, and sort of, well, yeah, what else can we do? Okay. And I think this model is now really coming to an end. And so either indeed the thing had better fall apart or become genuinely democratic. So in that sense, these crises or these chronic problems, I think that they can be very fruitful.
Okay, let's, Annalisa, if I bring you in, and just to say that Annalisa is Italian, so brings a kind of different perspective on this.
So what's the question?
Okay, the question is, going back to this week, do you see, when you have events, horrible events like happened in Brussels, do you think that kind of weakens the European idea, or do you think the European idea is so strong and so well embedded in most European countries that they recognise that, you know, it's something that they need unity to deal with rather than to
No, I think that it's very clear in the mind of most continental Europeans and most informed British people that the European ideal is not really an ideal at the moment, is an historic necessity, in the sense that the way the world is going and the way that everything we know is interconnected and intertwined means that you might hate the idea of the founding fathers, you might hate the idea of Brussels, but more cooperation is definitely what you need to actually face the challenges that we have. The challenge of the international terrorist threat is an asymmetric challenge, is extremely difficult to combat, and the only way you have to actually try to control and defend yourself is to integrate as maximum as possible the exchange of intelligence services and ideas. So what we have seen in Paris, what happened in Paris was a failure of intelligence between Belgium and France. So what is happening, just to respond on the security aspect, but we can talk about all the other challenges, climate change, the economic and financial threat that we face. But when it comes to security, what Brussels has showed you is that intelligence services are obliged to cooperate more, because otherwise we will just live continuously and daily. Even if you are outside the European Union, you will live with an enhanced threat. So even if Britain gets out of the European Union, unless it starts exchanging more information with other intelligence services, the threat will grow. Because what ISIS is proving in Brussels is that they are growing more ambitious by the day, more lethal by the day, and more organized. And the only way to respond to that threat is to respond with more cooperation. So the idea that you can have actually Brexit and that Britain would go deliberately towards less intelligence cooperation, because this is what would happen, because for a start he will get out of the Schengen information system. The Schengen information system, very few people know the difference between the Schengen system and the Schengen information system. The Schengen information system is one of the most advanced sharing of information between countries, and Britain has gained access to the Schengen information system even though it's not in the Schengen free movement area. So Britain would definitely be forced to leave the Schengen information system, so we'll have access to less information. So I think that what Brussels is doing now to the European cooperation is that it's giving a strengthening of the awareness that leaders need to work together more to face the terroristic threat.
Okay, let me ask you about that. I mean, do you, in the end, is that not one of the lessons of this, that actually facing such threats as the Islamic State and other elements like that, that in the end you need more Europe, not less Europe, you need closer cooperation? Isn't that the answer to it?
Well, it's always the answer of federalists in response to any problem. The response is always more Europe. Even Bernard-Henri Lévy yesterday on Newsnight, Europe is dying. The solution, we need to accelerate faster down the European autobahn towards the destination of a United States of Europe. But it does seem a little odd if you are facing these existential hazards looming on the EU autobahn before you, that the rational response should be to accelerate rather than slow down. Just to respond to some of the points that Annalisa made about the sharing of intelligence, as Sir Richard Dearlove, the ex-head of SIS, has said in Prospect, there's no reason why the British intelligence services shouldn't continue to cooperate with the European intelligence services. Post-Brexit, if we decide to leave, Norway and Switzerland are part of the various international cooperative bodies. They're not part of the
They're not part of the
EU.
Schengen information system.
And he also said that actually the British intelligence doesn't actually share that much with European intelligence agencies at the moment because they're so leaky. He compared them to colanders. Of course, the most vital intelligence sharing relationship is between Britain and the US, and I don't think that would be affected by our leaving the European Union. I think what we're looking at in Europe is a crisis of faith, and I think that's why Europe is dying. I think there are a number of reasons for that crisis. I think one of the reasons is that European intellectuals, theorists, leading European politicians, diplomats have far too much faith in the EU as an international institution and far too little faith in nationalism, for want of a better term. I think they wildly exaggerate the role the EU has played in keeping the peace in Europe in the second half of the 20th century. I think that's largely been due to the existence of NATO and of mutually assured nuclear destruction. I don't think the EU played a vital role in the preservation of the peace in the second half of the 20th century any more than the League of Nations did in the first half. It was nation states, after all, that preserved the peace in Europe for 100 years, between 1814 and 1914, the balance of power between what were predominantly nation states. And I think one of the causes of the rise of various disruptive ideologies which are posing such an existential threat to Europe, such as the nativist movements we see breaking out all over the continent, as well as regional independence movements in Scotland and Catalonia and elsewhere, but most profoundly Islamism, the emergence of radical Islamist ideologies all over Europe, is symptomatic of the decline of nationalism. Nationalism is capable of exercising a gravitational pull, blood and soil, which is an alternative to these poisonous internationalist ideologies. Communism and fascism, the two greatest threats, the two most murderous, toxic ideologies of the 20th century, were both, after all, internationalist, not nationalist movements. I think if, as nationalism has declined in Europe, we've seen that gravitational pull being replaced by something much more dangerous, disruptive and toxic and existentially threatening to our way of life, our rights, our liberties. And I also think that in the absence of nationalism, the idea of Europe doesn't command enough of people's loyalty, it doesn't give people a sense of identity, enough of a sense of identity and belonging to bring about the sacrifice of blood and treasure which may be necessary to defeat ISIS and related Islamist movements.
Let me just say something to you before I bring in Natalie. I mean, you talk about the idea of Europe dying. What's interesting, if you look at Greece, which has seen its economy decline by 25% over 6 years, I've never seen a poll in Greece where fewer than 60% of people want to remain both in the European Union and in the Euro. So I think there are, even though you see it dying, I think there is a lot of evidence that still, when people are asked, do you want to remain part of this body or this, this group of 28 member states, you never seem to get what you are talking about is people saying, well, that's it, we want out.
Well, I haven't seen any polls in Greece since the migration crisis reached its kind of current stage,
sure.
And certainly the people of Greece seem to be suffering the worst brunt of the migration crisis. But the direction of travel across Europe is towards independence and the breakup of the European Union, rather than the other direction.
Can I correct a couple of things that are just not accurate? Because I think that if we want really to help our audience understand what's going on, if there are things that are not accurate. So first of all, the European arrest warrant, even Darlov admitted that has been phenomenally useful for security. So there are ways of cooperation for what security is concerned that are recognized in Britain as very important. One of them is also Europol, which is led, by the way, by a British person. And secondly, you said that the problem with intellectuals believing in Europe is that they have an undying faith in the EU institution. This is not correct. I don't think that you would find, and Natalie can confirm, you would find any intellectual that really believe that the EU institutions are working and are properly functioning. In fact, it's the opposite. Everybody agrees that they're failing and they need reform. What intellectuals, most intellectuals agree on is the fact simply that cooperation is more needed now than going back to the 19th century idea of a nation state.
This is a cue to bring you in, Natalie. We began by all of us just talking about the events, obviously what's happened in Brussels this week, the bombs going off, what impact that has, not so much on the Brexit debate here, because that is unfolding, but what it does, particularly bearing in mind what happened in Paris, what it does, and I know you know Paris incredibly well, what it does to the idea of Europe. Does it begin to erode support, belief in the idea of Europe?
Well, I think these events in Brussels, as the terrorist attacks in Paris, as the refugee crisis, and these are, you know, the terrorist attacks on one side, the refugee crisis on another, are very different issues, very, very different issues, but they both have the result of spreading more skepticism not so much about the idea that we're all, together and we all face common threats. I mean, that's more or less accepted. That's become obvious. For those who thought that Paris would be the only target, well, that was forgetting that Copenhagen had been targeted, and Brussels, even 2 years ago, Brussels was targeted. And now in an amazingly painful way. And so we're all facing these threats together. And in a way, paradoxically, I think that that creates a sense of collectiveness, in a way. I mean, it may sound paradoxical, but I think Europeans have never, as much as today, been discussing similar issues, from one country to the next. Of course, we all have our different national silos, our different national politicians and debates, but there are issues now which exist across Europe in a way that arguably has never been the case before, and I think that's important to reflect on. I do think that what these terrorist attacks will do is alas, bring more wind to far-right movements across Europe. Remember, after the Paris attacks, which occurred on the 13th of November, we had regional elections in France, and Marine Le Pen and her National Front Party won slightly, just around 7 million votes. It was an incredible upsurge. It's true that later she did not win the control of a region in France, but that was more due to socialist candidates pulling out. But the overall result in statistics of her support base was striking, and not many commentators said that this had nothing to do with the terrorist act. So I expect that Brussels will bring more wind, more energy to those who say that each and every nation in Europe needs to pull up the drawbridge somehow. Not everybody has the channel, but just to, close borders entirely and just try to forget about what's going on elsewhere. And that is very much an illusion. And I think that what EU leaders and institutions are confronted with right now is not so much finding absolute and quick solutions to these huge problems. We know terrorism is not going to be addressed in the months or perhaps even in the years to come. This will be a long challenge and a long problem. And unfortunately, many experts say that there will be more terrorist attacks, and that we're in the middle of a series of such events. So this is going to be a long thing, and equally the migration and the refugee crisis, which has its sources in the Middle East, and where we see that the Syria war, even if diplomatic talks are underway, is hardly on the point of being resolved. So, and plus you factor in the migration push from Africa and other parts of the world. So we know that this is also going to be a long-term problem that we need to address. And what EU leaders and institutions need to do is, I think, send an urgent signal to EU citizens and voters that they are doing something about it, and that they're taking steps which somehow may start convincing people that they're finding parts at least of the solution. And I think one of the reasons for the surge in populist parties and movements throughout the continent, just a few weeks ago, a neo-Nazi party got elected to the Slovak parliament. This is a neo-Nazi party. It's not just far right. It's neo-Nazi, and they now have, I think, 14 MPs in the Slovak parliament. Slovakia has no migrants, no refugees, or hardly any. It has not had terrorist attacks, and yet we see these things happening. And I think it's a question of perceptions, that citizens need to feel that the institutions and the governments are slowly edging or are doing things. And I believe that Angela Merkel, who we have seen, in recent years, carry the mantle. Basically, you may or may not, agree with her economic policies, but in terms of what the strategic challenges that Europe has been confronted with, she has carried the mantle of of the European project and of European interests, I believe, not only in dealing with Russia, but also on the refugee crisis. And I think that she has come to the conclusion, and this was the motivation behind the deal between the EU and Turkey that she negotiated almost single-handedly. She has come to the conclusion that if we want to prevent Europe from turning brown politically, from going back to a past.
Many people regard that as shameful. Many people say it was a bilateral deal between Angela Merkel and it did not involve the rest of the EU. It undermined unity, and she had got herself in political trouble and was prepared to do a deal with the president of Turkey.
It's criticized in many ways. It's criticized by human rights organizations and very, very serious human rights organizations, and they have important points. I mean, their arguments are hard to dispute. It is criticized also by some other EU leaders, more or less privately, saying, you know, she went and did this on her own. But in the end, what happened? You know, it may not smell very nice, this deal, but in the end, what happened is there was an EU-wide agreement to clench this deal, and the aim was to send the signal to EU citizens that we are trying to stem the flow of migrants. And that, I think the whole aim was to send this signal after a full year or almost a year of uncontrolled and dramatic, uncontrolled refugee movements and dramatic scenes in Europe. So I think that her point was to try to neutralize the narrative of the far right across Europe by at least putting down that deal and saying, you know, we've done something.
Let me just ask Joris about this. Do you think these statements and these attempts by Angela Merkel will neutralize the appeal of the far right? I mean, you're Dutch. Geert Wilders is, presumably polling fairly strongly.
He's now polling best. Not that he's going to be in the government, because we have a different system. But yeah, he's now the biggest party in the polls. And then there's also the Socialist Party, which is sort of, you strip out the xenophobia, and it's the same program, and that's another 15% of the electorate. And this is one of the founding nations, and it's often one of the vanguard nations. So it's, you know, things like abortion, euthanasia, legalized soft drugs. Holland somehow is sometimes can be a laboratory. And I think the crisis goes much deeper than the things we mentioned. It's also between the elites and a whole neoliberal framework which has been rolled out over Europe, which I think the deal is always between ordinary people and their elites. As you protect us, and in exchange you'll have some privileges. And now people feel that their elites aren't protecting them. And economically they're just telling them, look, we'll make you more competitive. And so there's a far deeper, I think, breakdown of trust, and also just confidence in the competence. And so I was struck to pick up on one word, is this more Europe term. Because this has been going on for decades now, that we're presented this false choice between either Nigel Farage or more Europe. So Verhofstadt or Nigel Farage, those are the two. And I think we are by now mature enough that Auschwitz is not going to happen if the EU falls apart. You know, it's a different phase in history. And so we should by now be talking about what kind of EU do we want. And so I think on some areas we want far more cooperation. I think on others we want far less, because one of the great things about Europe is its diversity. And it's now being homogenized out of a centralizing ideology in the name of, let's just come closer in whatever way we can, because cooperation is always good, because the alternative is Auschwitz. And I think this is, but for this, in order to have that European-wide conversation, I think we need to make it Europe-wide. We need to create this European demos, and if it doesn't work, we should dismantle the whole thing.
Annalisa.
Well, this was called 20 years ago when I started covering Europe at Euronews just after the Maastricht Treaty. It was called l'Europe à la carte, and it was the Antichrist. So you're right, but this has long gone. I don't think that anyone who deals with Europe now still thinks that we're going to be in this super state, ever closer union. The ever closer union exists only in the mind of Eurosceptics. It has never really existed for real in the mind of the greatest majority of states in Europe, at least since the mid-90s. So I think that a lot of what you say is true. And I think that there is a consensus, and in this Italy is leading, that we need to redo this union. The difference in the criticism of this union is that someone thinks that the better way to rebuild the building cooperation that we need anyway is to destroy everything and start anew. while most reasonable pro-European think, oh, wait a minute, because actually there is a storm here. We are under attack. There is instability south, instability east. We are in a very, very dangerous moment in history. Before breaking things out, before throwing all the toys out of the pram, why don't we try to see how we can fix it, how we can get rid of the things that don't work?
And also have to see that there is not one leader in Europe today, one elected, in governing politician who says he wants the breakup of the EU. I mean, we're facing huge problems, but the reality is there's not one single prime minister or a head of state in Europe that is saying I want the breakup of the EU. I mean,
David, can I get you to comment upon what Natalie was saying about Angela Merkel? How do you see her position? I mean, she very much during the Eurozone crisis was Frau Europe. It took her time to come around to the fact that Germany would have to be involved in these bailouts, but she did. She became much more a kind of pro-European in her comments and took this decision over the refugee crisis. And she's widely praised. Time magazine made her the Woman of the Year. Frau, she was called, I think, I forgot what it was now, Frau for Europe or whatever. But she was praised internationally for the position she had taken, and is seen very much as the sort of linchpin of the whole European Union, its institutions. How do you read her position?
I think that she's made a couple of huge strategic blunders which have plunged the EU into existential jeopardy. I think the first blunder was to lay out the welcome mat for Syrian refugees without much consultation with her European neighbours. And I'm glad that Annalisa brought up the British head of Europol, who recently warned that there were between 3,000 and 5,000 ISIS-trained jihadi terrorists at large in Europe, in the EU, many of whom have crossed the border along with the million-plus Syrian refugees that entered Germany last year. So that is a crisis of Angela Merkel's own making. I also think that inviting all these people who aren't from our tradition and who come from a very different culture and tradition to Europeans, as well as the move she's made to bring the inclusion of Turkey and its population of 75 Muslims into the European Union. It looks as though if the deal is ratified, they'll be granted visa-free travel within the Schengen zone as soon as June. I think that makes it.
That's not true. That's not true.
But it makes it inviting so many non-Europeans to.
The entry of Turkey in the European Union is not on the cards.
Nor is visa-free travel for Turks, actually.
Isn't that part of the deal?
No. If you read the deal, and the deal says that if 72 conditions are met by Turkey, then by June it might be considered. And believe me, nobody is expecting Turkey to meet those 72
conditions. But it'll still
conditions.
get the 6 billion. I think just
but it's an essential.
To put this in the context of my broader point, I think this is symptomatic of Angela Merkel's. She's trying to expiate German war guilt and her general sense of guilt as a Western European. And I think this is one of the problems whenever European intellectuals, political leaders do try and articulate an idea of Europe that we can all unify behind. And you say that that becomes kind of more tangible in the wake of atrocities like the one that's just happened in Belgium. What I see is a kind of ritual, a kind of post-traumatic ritual that takes place with flags being projected onto buildings, people expressing solidarity, platitudes and thought for the day style homilies being uttered by world leaders. Nothing wrong with it, but I don't think it constitutes a tangible idea of Europe capable of uniting the European people. And whenever anyone tries to put more flesh on those bones to talk up the Declaration of Human Rights or Enlightenment values, they immediately run aground against this kind of post-colonial guilt. Very interesting book written by Pascal Bruckner, a French intellectual, called The Tyranny of Guilt, an essay in Western masochism, in which he compares the European intellectual class to a medieval clergy, a penitential class. They're constantly engaging in this kind of self-flagellation.
I'm sorry, you're really talking a lot of nonsense.
Natalie, what is talk?
I read that book. It has nothing to do with the EU.
Please, you weren't called upon.
Anyway, we'll have questions shortly. We'll get involved in questions very soon. But I mean, one thing I was going to ask you is that is the problem that the European Union faces is that it's actually a halfway house. It's not actually the United States of Europe, and yet there are clearly a lot of people who are in the European Parliament, certainly who work in the European institutions, who see that as the direction of travel. And that when, for instance, during the Eurozone crisis, I remember Angela Merkel talking about, the need for more Europe. And during the refugee crisis, she said Europe is going to have to change. And isn't that the push and the pull here, that there is, in the end, for instance, if there's to be common debt, or if there is to be maybe a resolution to the problem of how to patrol the external borders, Europe does need to move towards much greater integration and cooperation. And the problem is it's stranded in a halfway house.
Yes, I think the federalist vision and what you alluded to, the notion of a European demos. I think that's not anything realistic at this moment. And
you think that's?
I think right now nobody is really talking about a federalist, federalist evolution of Europe. That's what's happening right now. Is people are trying to keep whatever has been built over the last 60 years. Next year will be the 60th. Is it the 60th? Yeah, the 60th anniversary next year of the signing of the Treaty of Rome, which is the founding treaty of the European Economic Community. And I think what's happening right now is that because of all these challenges and problems and threats from the outside and from within, people are basically trying to keep the project together. There's no, it may sometimes seem from the debate in this country that Europe is this humongous monster, ready to gobble up and limit everybody's freedom. But in fact, it's barely holding. It's barely holding, and there are urgent questions that are currently being addressed, or people are trying to address them. But there's no big thrust to move towards a federalist entity or some kind of superstate. That's and equally a European demos. When I said that Europeans now are sharing similar concerns across the continent, it has to do with many things. We know everything is now transnational. We're in a globalized world. How could Europe be not globalized within itself? How could Europeans not be concerned about what's going on in other parts of this region? And also, I think technology and connectiveness is spreading that kind of sense that we can all interact, and we can follow events in Warsaw and demonstrations in Warsaw, or Podemos in Spain, or events in Greece, as if they were almost on our doorstep. So this is a new sense of proximity, I think, but it doesn't mean indeed that our national and cultural differences have faded. Not at all. And I think the whole European project was about diversity. Actually, it was about building something that would make sense for all of us collectively, but preserving the diversity. There's never been an overarching plan to dilute and make us all, into one single identity. That was never the case. Those who claimed that was the case are just
Natalie, if there was a similar referendum to the one we're holding in France at the moment, what would be the result?
I think people would vote to remain.
Would it be close?
No, I don't think so. The only politician who is saying in France today that she would, like to see France withdraw from the EU, and she has said that she would organize a similar referendum if she came to power, is Marine Le Pen. Mm-hmm. And she's not a majority. Her party does not have a majority by any means. It's grown. It's a threat. She's very savvy. She wants to reach power, unlike her father, who never wanted to reach power. But pretended to. She's absolutely decided to reach power sometime, and I don't believe it'll be in 2017, but I think she'll give it a push for the parliamentary elections afterwards. But anyway, I do believe it would be Remain.
Okay.
And because no serious politician is saying we should break this up and France should withdraw. She's the only one saying it, but she's also occasionally pulled back on that because she knows it's not popular, actually.
Yeah, yeah.
She knows that's not popular.
Did you want to say?
Well, it sounds like both Natalie and, well, everyone else on the panel is calling for reform, and seem to me to be naively optimistic about the prospects of the institutions of the European Union being reformed. We saw the Herculean effort undertaken by our Prime Minister to try and persuade the European Union to make the tiniest concessions in the face of a threat by the British people to leave, and to try and persuade various European leaders and the President of the European Commission to make some minuscule, microscopic, cosmetic reforms to the European Union, and was almost universally unsuccessful. So the notion that Europe could somehow reform itself and cure its ills by reforming itself is completely naive. That's not going to happen.
But it's not you. Right. How are they, just one moment, how are the Dutch papers reporting the British referendum, and how do they see what's happening here?
Well, it's a real interesting change, because I've been living here for 5 years now, and I think it's only 3 years ago that we Dutch journalists were called into the embassy, and we were giving this very boring lecture by the ambassador how important it was to keep the Brits on board. And really, it's been, say, the last 6 months, there's this notable shift among policymakers, European ambassadors, and higher politicians who are not only resigned, that was about 6 months ago, but now they're not so much looking forward to it, but are beginning to see many of the advantages of Brexit. And it's not a big issue. That's another thing. I mean, British journalists, when they report about the EU, they only consult British sources. And so there's always a salience bias of thinking that because your sources are so interested in yourself, that the rest of Europe is interested in you. And not really. I'm trying to get pieces in the Dutch newspapers about Brexit, and there isn't that much interest. It's refugees, 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 refugees. That's the big issue, not you. But when you talk about it, it's striking how a number of commentators are also shifting. And I think there's a growing realization that we have to give up this fantasy that at some point the English, because the Scots are different, the English will get their heart into Europe. There is no, that you have a different history, you have a different concept of nationalism, different experience in the war, no revolution, no occupation. And so I think there is a growing idea that if we're going to make the Eurozone work, we're going to have to centralize at least a number of powers. For that, we just cannot have this Trojan horse called England. And it would also be wonderful if Britain leaves, then a lot of British journalists will be pulled back out of Brussels, and we will.
Everybody will be happy.
Well, all this, tearing us down in front of the rest of the world, pissing on us out of domestic concerns, and this kind of, privately educated about Europe, just let out your inner chauvinist at the expense of Europeans. That can stop. So I think there are more and more advantages, and I'm trying to tell the Dutch people about them.
Okay. Right. Annalisa, I mean...
It is true. If you want really to talk about what's the mood on the continent about the British leaving, indeed, in Brussels, there are a lot of people that say, yes, good riddance.
There are, but I mean, publicly, for instance, Matteo Renzi, he said it's inconceivable to think of Europe without the UK.
True. Matteo Renzi is really very, very keen for Britain to stay in, because he agrees with David Cameron almost on everything. So most of the things that David Cameron wanted, he wants to do something similar with Italy. So, there was a kind of a perfect alignment. So Matteo Renzi does believe that Europe needs a massive shake-up. But nobody was really hoping that David Cameron in 3 months negotiations was going to reform the EU. Only he could think that someone would believe that. Because what kind of negotiation is one in which someone says to 28 hours, give me something so that I stay? And people say, excuse me a minute, we are 28 here. If we start giving toys and to the children to keep them in the playground, then we're not going to be credible. So that negotiation was a farce. But, and everybody knows that. But the fact that Britain could actually stay in and be a really formidable drive for reform, this is a fact. And Italy
somebody like Wolfgang Schäuble, for instance, the German finance minister, absolutely believes that.
Yeah, Britain could lead the European Union in reforming it from inside, not from outside. So,
but we've had 3 decades of brainwashing here. It will just not happen.
Okay, let's say that it doesn't happen, but Italy is very keen next year with the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome that Natalie was reminding us of the existence, to give a really big push. And one interesting idea that goes in your direction that I've heard in Italy and in other quarters in Europe is actually Britain getting out. It's a good idea. Because next year, Britain goes out, we launch the Treaty of Rome kind of celebrations, and we launch a very serious and thorough refundation of the European Union, in which we keep the initial ideal of the Treaty of Rome, which is what can we pool together of our sovereignty to make us stronger, which is true now as it was true 60 years and even more, because now we are more interconnected. So one idea could be that Britain could actually trigger a proper rethinking of the European Union.
I think there are also actually deep concerns about a possible Brexit on the continent.
I was going to say
they are very deep, and it doesn't mean that there's a sense that the whole EU project will completely unravel if Britain pulls out.
There is a risk.
Well, that's what Juncker feels.
But I wouldn't be too confident about that, because I think if you set one precedent, look at it, people on the continent, in government or who are looking at these issues. Are worried that if Britain sets that precedent, then indeed it will have some kind of domino in the future, not immediately, but it opens the possibility of a domino effect. So there is a threat, an existential threat to the EU project from a Brexit. Okay. But the overarching thing is that Britain leaving would completely weaken. It would definitely weaken the project. It would weaken it on a democratic level. This is possibly historically the most stable democracy in the EU, and if it leaves, then that I think weakens the whole issue of democracy in Europe.
I think, very quickly, because I think we need to move to questions.
I mean,
as well.
I thought it was revealing that Annalise used the word children to describe the British delegation in Brussels, as though the elected leader of the world's 5th largest economy is a child. And I think that is how the European Commissioners regard the elected leaders of troublesome European nations, as essentially children. They're the only grown-ups in the room. I think it's good to hear that certainly the Dutch don't seem to be too interested in Britain remaining. Let's hope that most European peoples take a similar view, because one of the arguments the Remainers make is that the Europeans will punish Britain for leaving out of a sort of spite, because they'll be so cross that they'll impose trade barriers, even though it's not in Europe's own economic interest, because the value of their trade here is greater than ours. They'll do it out of spite because they'll be so cross that we've left. But it's good to hear that that's not true. But I do think that actually you may be right, and I think one of the reasons some perhaps more sagacious EU leaders are concerned about the possibility of Brexit is because I think it will foment independence movements in other countries, like in France, and calls for referenda across Europe, and they may well result. But actually, I think that'll only be to the good, and the sooner the EU becomes more like the common market and becomes essentially a glorified trade association, which I think it serves a very useful purpose in being, the better.
Okay, let's move to questions, and how we're going to do this is if you can keep the questions quite brief, and then we'll get through as many as we can. Let's start at the back, and then we'll try and get through as many as we can.
Yeah. I have a question to the Mr. who just spoke.
For Toby?
Yeah. Yeah. What exactly would he like to change when it comes to the EU? Just give some examples, and also general questions. Question is, do someone remind me what the people from the war zone are fleeing from what kind
Sorry, I didn't hear that last bit.
From what people, the migrants, so-called migrants, what are they fleeing from? What kind of people?
Okay. If you answer this, thank you. If you answer it briefly, and we'll try and get through as many as we can, because there's quite a lot of people who want to ask.
Yeah, well, as I just said, I think I would like the European Union to become essentially a glorified trade association to enable the different countries of Europe to trade freely without tariffs. And I think as a free trade zone, it works very well, and I'd like to see it continue to work in that way. But I don't think any more pooling of sovereignty than's required to sustain that free trade area is advisable. And I think any attempt to push Europe towards the federalist dream of becoming a United States of Europe is doomed to failure. And rather than see it collapse in a kind of disorderly manner, which might well lead to armed conflicts of the kind we saw in the last century, much better if Europe just deflates in a peaceable way.
Okay, let's just take a question here at the front. We may get a chance to come back to that a little bit later.
The name's Ewan Grant. I am a former law enforcement intelligence analyst, and I was working when Andrew Parker, the present head of MI5, came into our organisation to save us from managerial incompetence and corruption. My question is, what do the Central European institutions, particularly the Commission, add to the effective cooperation between member states? And would a Brexit and reduction in press interest in the UK, presumably, would that lead to less uncovering of wrongdoing? Very quickly, Rob Wainwright has been mentioned several times. Please, everybody in this room, regardless of their nationality, be very, very grateful that that gentleman was appointed, and be very, very scared and worried that the person who was rolled up to him got so near to taking up that post. That really, the Europeans have an awful lot of questions to answer about that one. Thank you.
Natalie, would you like to just answer the initial point?
On the Commission?
Yeah, on the Commission. What do they actually... I mean, obviously it's the executive.
Yes.
And your question is, what does it add to intelligence, security, cooperation? Or do you want to answer that?
Well, on anything, actually, but not just necessarily security and cooperation, but member states working together collectively and bilaterally. I think the European Commission's bureaucracy really does have to reform, regardless of whether you're an outer or an inner.
Yeah. I mean, the Commission represents the whole bloc, 500 million people, in any negotiation and not just trade. And it has done very, very concrete things. It has, for example, it has worked on combating cartels, or and taken antitrust measures. And remember, a few years ago, it dealt, this goes back, I think, quite a few years ago, it dealt with Microsoft, but just as it is also dealing with Google, just as it is dealing with relations with Russia to a certain extent. This is an important point, not just...
Trade, yes, Russia, no.
No, the Commission has,
health and safety, the standards of regulations for health,
and with
the
China.
medical scandal. I mean, the protection of consumers. That's what the Commission does. It works as an emanation of the 28 countries to try to help them work better together. It does not have decision power. Most of the decision powers are intergovernmental. They are with government, with the Council of Ministers, and with the Parliament. And the Commission has less bureaucrats, I think, than the City of Manchester. So when we have this idea of those millions of Brussels bureaucrats, let's double check the facts, because actually, as more as it is, having to deal with 500 million people in 28 countries is doing an egregious job. When it comes to security, they have very, very little competencies, because the security, defense, they are all very, very well guarded at a national level. But they have been helping in coordinating more cooperation. And what they're trying to do now is something very interesting and very important, which is to build an external border which is better guarded, because it's easier to guard the external border of the EU than to guard 28 countries. Yeah, but that's what they do. They try to help coordinate what is a very, very big piece of the world.
Okay, let's have another question over here.
So this goes for anybody on the panel. So I believe that for many English people who aren't, or British in fact, who aren't clued up about the pros and cons of Brexit, it is very emotive for many people when they think about why we're going to leave the EU. They think of terrorism, migration, the fear of it. However, I personally believe that in the grand scheme of things, the issues of a lot of British people is that we're not clued up on the facts, and I think the issues of newspapers, every day we read pro-Brexit, against Brexit, every single day. There's not enough still neutralism. The Economist is probably the only thing that I've read thus far that shows sort of a neutral approach, but are against Brexit. However, apart from that, the issue that I have is with regards to Brexit and this idea that there's no other alternative, you can't survive without it. Why can't we pull, a Norway in inverted commas? We can not be in the EU and still have access to a single market. I think what a lot of people don't understand is that, for example, on the facts alone, the IDF and other facts and figures, a lot of people don't realise that we are Germany's second biggest exporter. I'm pretty sure if we left the EU, the sheer fear of us leaving, the potential millions of jobs lost, there'll be trade agreements popping up left, right and centre.
That's not correct, unfortunately. That's an argument that is being repeated and repeated and repeated, and is not correct. Because there is a difference between a free trading area and a single market. There is a very fundamental difference. So Britain would be leaving both. Would be leaving trade and would be leaving the single market. But if you think what is the biggest thing that Britain exports, it's services, financial services. They are not goods that you sell on which you put tariffs. They are very delicate goods because they change the life of people, banking. So to be a banker in Europe, to have access to the people wallets, you need to belong to the single market. That's not a tariff. That's not
Norway belongs to the single market, and it's not part of the European Union.
Yes, that's my point exactly.
But it pays the same amount of money, and it has to obey regulation for a very simple reason, because when you are selling financial services to the people, you have to be following the regulations. So it's not about tariffs. This idea of the cars sold by Germany to the UK is a bit of poppydock,
the problem with that argument is that only something like 6% of British companies actually do business in the EU. 94% don't, and yet the EU regulations apply both to the companies that don't do any business as well as the companies that do business in them.
The banking
so if we could get a deal,
10% of the British economy.
If we got a deal like the Canadians, whereby the single market regulations only apply to those companies that are actually doing business in the single market, we'd effectively liberate 94% of British companies who wouldn't be hidebound by EU regulations in spite of not doing any business in the EU. And okay, the 6% wouldn't have any control over the regulations, they wouldn't have a seat at the table, but that's only 6% of British companies, so it wouldn't be a catastrophic
problem. Britain doesn't export that many goods anymore. That's the thing. We're not talking about goods, we're talking about services. That's what Britain really exports massively. That's the thing that
Norway
matters for Britain.
exports services to the EU, has access to the single
market. Norway pays the same and has to respect regulations. So the case of Norway doesn't hold water because they pay the same contribution to be part of the member and they have to respect the same regulations. So why breaking up everything if you have to go back and do like Norway, that you pay the same amount and you respect regulations? I don't understand.
Right, okay, I'm going to bring in, sorry, we may come back to that. There are lots of questions.
Hello, my name is David Chubb. For the younger members of the audience who may not know this, we voted in 1975 to stay in or come out of a European trading group. It wasn't an EU. It wasn't something which we agreed would take away our sovereignty. We had, I also want to say this, we were taken in illegally, undemocratically. There's been no talk here about democracy. It's all about fear of jobs, fear of this going up, fear of that going up. There's something else I want to say. I understand that the Second World War made a lot of people fearful of Nazism, fascism, right-wingers. That's all I hear. I don't hear about left-wingers, Pol Pot, Stalin, Mao Zedong, who killed millions. There is no balance. Everything seems to be...
What's your question?
Okay, my question to the audience, my question to the panel is, how can you sell me the argument that the EU is democratic? We don't have a constitution either.
I can try.
Joris, why don't you come in?
I think this is fundamental, and I think the biggest fantasy of all seems to be with the Remain camp, because they're saying, why can't we just be part of a market? As if a market is this neutral, objective thing that happens when the government steps back. And 5 decades of social science have made amply clear that markets are political constructs. And so where we are now in Europe is that the markets and the way the market is designed and the big major political decisions are all delegated to technocrats with a limited mandate and lobbyists with superior means. And this is how our market has become the plaything of big corporations, because they bring in the strongest lobbyists. So the idea that Europe can be democratic while not having a democratic system to decide on what kind of market we want is, I think, the biggest mistake of all. And we've seen this with finance, is that mid-90s there was this really clever new idea. It was called the credit default swap. And it was just, we just decided not to regulate it. And in 2008 it exploded in our faces. Now, if you look closely at every market, there are major political decisions on categories, on what to pursue, intellectual property. These are human constructs, and they always disenfranchise some and benefit others. It's a political process, and if you don't have a commensurate political power to keep that market in check, it will be captured by trusts and by lobbyists. And so I think the Remain camp, by saying, well, can't we just be part of a market, is the most democratic of all. And I think it's to be welcomed. There is a trade-off between sovereignty and becoming part of Europe. But the idea that we can have this for a few more decades and continue to rely on those technocrats and those lobbyists, I think is even more dangerous than the inflow of refugees.
Okay, just one. Natalie, make the case about, is the EU democratic?
First of all, I don't think Britain will lose its sovereignty or lose any of its sovereignty if it stays in the EU. No, it's shared a little bit of its sovereignty, but it benefits from the sharing. I think the EU should be. I mean, there's such a negative narrative about the EU in this country, and there has been for so long in the media that I have to admit it's a bit of a struggle well, there was a referendum. There was a referendum.
I think
Who thinks the 1975 referendum wasn't democratic? Well, I mean, I'm sorry. There was a referendum.
It was asking us whether we want to be part of a common market, not a United States of Europe. I think
there is no United States of Europe. I think the EU should be seen more as an opportunity. It's not perfect. It needs to build on the democratic side, that's for sure. But it has done so in the past. It has constantly reformed. It's not true to say the EU cannot reform. It has constantly reformed ever since its creation. Look at the timeline. Look at the different names it had. Look at the different treaties that it's adopted. So this is actually an entity that has constantly transformed. It's right now in dire straits and it's running into difficulty, and it's unpopular because many governments and many politicians hold EU institutions responsible for problems that they aren't solving and that they don't want to address in a decent way. I think the EU is an easy punching ball. It's become the punching ball. The EU institutions have become punching ball for politicians who don't want to even account for their own responsibilities in some of the decisions that they've made. It has become more democratic. One example of how the EU has become more democratic, and it still has to go further, is that the EU Parliament has more powers than when it was first elected in 1979. And possibly, if there is to be more economic integration within the Eurozone, then I think it would make sense, and that there's been talk about that, of having some kind of parliament of the Eurozone, so that we don't see the narrative that came out of the Greek crisis, which is, we're under the diktat of Brussels.
I've got to come back on this, Gavin. The argument about the common market that gentleman's making is that we were asked in 1975 whether we wanted to be part of the common market, not part of the European Union. So we don't think, those of us on the Brexit side, that the European Union does have a democratic mandate from the British people. But to make the sovereignty and the democracy point, even Chuka Umunna...
What's happening this year is you're going to have your say on the project the way it is.
Finally, yeah, and that was blood out of a stone. But the sovereignty. If I just would just put the sovereignty argument. Even Chuka Umunna acknowledges that 50% of Britain's laws are influenced or made in Europe, and they're not made by people over whom we can exercise any democratic control. The people drafting the laws, tabling the legislation in Europe, are the appointed, not the elected, the appointed.
But there's a council
European
of ministers.
But the people who draft the laws, are the European commissioners, who aren't elected by anyone. They are appointed. That's the sovereignty.
And we saw it
just to make this vivid. We saw it when David Cameron went begging bowl in hand to ask for some shred of control over the benefits we give to newly arrived European immigrants. Those are benefits that the UK taxpayer pays for. The fact that we don't have sovereignty over our benefit system was brought home very vividly during that negotiation. He was asking Europe's permission to us not to give benefits to people who'd been here for a short amount of time.
Right,
it more or less wasn't.
I am going to bring in another question now, please.
My question will be a bit different. I wanted to ask about the money that will be given to Turkey with the immigrants. Will the money be given in stages, and how will one monitor the money used for the purpose that it is meant for?
Well, I believe it will be given in stages.
It's 6 billion in the next 3 years, and they will be administered by a special team, what I understand, but it's all in the process of being decided.
Special team?
They would be, I think they are deploying something like 600 experts from all the European countries that are going to contribute to the fund. And they are going to kind of see in which way they can use it to the best use for the refugees and for building hospitals, schools for all these people that are coming into Turkey, for them to stay there in human conditions. But there are a lot of things that are to be seen, to be confirmed, and there are a lot of concerns, especially from the United Nations refugees agencies that are very, very worried, because Turkey, one of the reasons why it will not get tomorrow into the European Union, has a very, very bad record in respecting human rights. So there are concerns there.
Okay, you wanted to ask a question.
May I bring the panel back to the foundations of Europe in terms of monetary and fiscal policy? Initially, there was many concerns about achieving fiscal policy and the transfer of wealth across Europe. That's never ever really been achieved, and the political discussion has always sat above that. Therefore, unless you go back and readdress the foundation of harmonising, if you like, the United States that has a single currency central bank and transfer of wealth across the states, you will never achieve it.
Mm-hmm. And I have to say that there is quite a lot of people within the EU who believe that whatever has been decided to try and sort out the Eurozone crisis hasn't actually addressed the imbalances that still exist, the huge imbalances. And of course, the big problem there is that Germany, the one thing Germany will not agree is to becoming a transfer union or being part of a transfer union. Yet as things remain, there are these big imbalances, and how do you deal with those big imbalances? Well, you keep down wages and you keep down spending. And of course, that is one of the pressures we haven't spoken about. I mean, I think today I heard that French unemployment has gone up again. It's at 25%, I think, in Greece. Italian unemployment. This is part of the Eurozone story, but I don't know if anybody else wanted to.
No, I agree. I mean, you're talking about the way the single currency was created. Of course, it's a project that had many holes in it. It was born from a political vision more than a detailed, concrete and sustainable, at that time, financial vision, and the political vision was that of Kohl and Mitterrand, who after, it was prepared before, but basically after German reunification, decided that they wanted to harness this core Europe, and that's and because of its flaws, because transfers weren't possible, fiscality, there was no unified fiscal system, many other issues. We saw how badly Europe was hit by the 2008-2009 crisis. But I think this is, you know, and I don't know if we're out of the woods on that one. Frankly, I don't know. But that this will be constantly a work in progress seems obvious to me. I don't see the Eurozone disappearing.
Yeah, certainly the Greek crisis has not gone away. When you've got a country with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 190%, nobody can claim, even though it's on its third bailout, that the crisis has gone away. Sorry, you wanted to say?
Yeah, of course, it's just part of the insanity of trying to yoke these wildly different economies together in a single currency, which has proved to be an absolute unqualified disaster and may well do for Europe. I just wanted to respond to this lady's very good point, I thought, about the monitoring of how the 6 billion is spent by Turkey. Of course, it won't be monitored. They can't even monitor how money is spent within the EU. The EU hasn't been given a clean regularity report by its auditors in almost 20 years. So the notion that they'll be able to properly monitor the expenditure of this 6 billion in a country which isn't part of the EU is, of course, nonsense. And it's a ridiculously poor deal that they've got for this 6 billion, because all it will enable them to do is essentially deport illegal immigrants from Greece to Turkey. But for every illegal immigrant that arrives in Turkey, there'll be another immigrant who's been processed within Turkey, will then be released into the European Union. So it's just kicking the can down the road.
Right, we've probably got a chance for just a few more questions over here. I'll try and keep them as brisk as we can.
You described the Brexit as you described it actually as an opportunity of a precedent that could lead to a domino effect in Europe. Others on the panel described it as a threat for a domino effect. But isn't it really a question on whether this experiment would be a successful one for Britain? And I think I'm sure, Toby, you see prosperous prospects for Britain outside of the EU, but I would be curious about the opinion of the others on the panel. What would be the implications for the UK, and then again the implications of this possibly failed experiment on the unity of Europe?
Well, it was said just now that the EU would punish Britain out of spite. I don't think it will happen out of spite, but it will happen. Because, of course, there's then a real threat of unraveling. So to make Brexit look as unattractive as possible will be a geopolitical imperative. And, of course, there are many opportunities to really hit Britain. I mean, people live here in a sort of cuckoo land where they just don't want to hear about how dependent they are on the EU, but they are. I mean, when Jamie Dimon tells you there will be massive dislocation of the city, yes, you have a huge current account deficit. Your country is a fiscal basket case. It finances itself through printing money and credit bubbles. There will be real pain. I mean, if there's a real shock to the system, we've seen that with the euro. If you have a fair weather system like the British fiscal position, and you have a shock and uncertainty, you will suffer. And if sterling collapses. So yeah, and it will be very attractive for the Europeans to make the Brits really suffer, to show all the other countries, look, this is not a good way to go. That's why we should have an amicable divorce, I think, which would be much better.
Divorces are never an amicable, jolly thing. I mean, Toby, I don't know how
many you've had?
How many you've had? You seem to be an expert in how to lose friends and alienate people, but actually, it's okay with your friends, but when you talk about 27 other countries and what consequences that will be, they are completely unpredictable. The reality is that it's very, very likely that a lot of people would actually take advantage of it and not give any favors to Britain for having said to the club, you're rotten, you smell, and we're going to go away. Of course not. Of course they're not going to give them favor. And there are a number of things, both that are geopolitical and properly economical. So not even getting into what are all the reports, because we get a loss of GDP between 1.5 and 2.5. I think it's the Bank of England, so an independent institution that is British, so not someone else.
Not the Bank of England.
They've actually assessed that only the uncertainty of fixing trade deals with other 27 countries and the time it will take will create a vacuum, and investors do not like uncertainty because they don't like what is going to happen to their money. So the likelihood is that there will be at least a 10 years period for Britain in which it will be either chaos or catastrophe from an economic point of view.
I think I agree with Yaris. It would be what we want is an amicable divorce, but you can't have an amicable divorce until you've broken up. So we have to break up with Europe first and then embark upon what will hopefully be an amicable divorce. The argument that Europe will punish the UK for leaving the European Union, I think that's fanciful, because I don't see how Europe can punish the UK economically without suffering itself, because after all, the value of the goods that the 27 other EU states sell in the UK is greater than the value of the UK's exports to Europe. Now, that is correct, but the counter-argument, I'll help you out here,
of the UK that the UK gets from the EU is 12%. The share of income that the EU gets from the UK is 3% of the GDP. So Britain will suffer much more than the rest of the EU. And you have to be straight with the facts. I think we're talking about something that is going to decide the destiny of this country.
So I will be straight with the facts. The data is that something like 45% of our exports go to the EU, and something like 14% of the other 27 member states, 14% of their exports are sold in the UK. So the argument the Remainers usually make is that they could afford to take more of a hit because collectively their economies are less dependent upon trade with the UK than our economy is on trade with the remainder of the EU. But actually, they couldn't afford to take that hit. Lots of the European economies, Italy, for example, Greece, Portugal, even the French economy, are on the edge of a death spiral. They're teetering on the verge of collapse. Unemployment is out of control. Okay. The idea that they could take a small hit in order to punish Britain to discourage others.
Just one final question, because actually we have to...
Can I just say something?
We've got to wind up the session.
Just as I said earlier, that I do think the EU would suffer terribly if Britain left. I think Britain, as a country that does want to say things to the world and have some kind of influence, will lose beyond all the economic and technical aspects of this divorce. I think Britain would severely suffer in its influence in whatever it wants to get done in the world, or even for its for itself or for others. Will lose that weight very, very much. And next, it's likely that next month you will hear this message from Obama. I'm not saying Obama is has the absolute final word on this. He doesn't.
Because they love pooling their sovereignty to the US, don't they?
He will come to this country, and he will say to British voters, if you want your country to have some weight in the world, then you should stay with this club and and help it through and work to reform it and be part of that orchestra, and that actor, the European Union. This isn't. We aren't living in a world of the 1950s or the 1960s, or even before. Britain will be seen as a much smaller actor on the world stage, on the European stage, if it leaves. And I think people have to have that in mind, on issues that people care about, that whether it's climate change or, I don't know, development aid, or helping people who find themselves in difficult situations in different parts of the world. The UK will really, really diminish itself if it falls out, if it pulls itself out of the EU. And it's not just because the cost of this Brexit scenario is not just that there's a strong possibility that sterling would go down on the 24th of June. There's a much longer and long-lasting cost to this country. And I think people want the UK to have a voice and to weigh. But if it becomes a small Singapore, if it just becomes a financial platform on the edge of the Atlantic, we will lose that voice, and you will lose it as well.
Okay, I think I know there are lots more questions, but also I'm being signalled that from.
I just wondered if the panel and you, Gavin, could maybe end by offering what you think Europe will look like in 10 years' time, kind of picture of the continent in a decade's time?
Okay, well, okay. Then, do you want to go? Europe? It's a hard one, isn't it? But it's Europe in 10 years' time.
Yeah. So I've always thought that Scotland would stay in the UK, Greece would stay in the Eurozone, and the UK will stay in the EU, if only because the markets will panic 2 weeks before the referendum. And then all those home-owning telegraph readers will suddenly think, I have a lot of debt. Do I really want interest rates to return to historical average? Maybe not. Well, we'll just go back to the old game of blaming Europe for everything. So I think that we will look back 10 years later, and just that we've just wasted so much time on while all the other big issues were left untouched. I think still the referendum is a really good thing. There's a real trade-off. You can try to shape world events and you can respond to world events. Now, if you're going to be part of Europe, you can help shape them, but you will lose some of the power in responding to them. If you're out of Europe, you're no longer shaping world events. You become this little island with a nuclear bomb that probably won't work, but you'll be able to respond to them because you have autonomy. That's a real trade-off, and I think if both camps were honest about this, I think it would really help the debate.
It's not very funny.
Annalisa.
Not very funny.
Okay,
for you.
Annalisa, your vision for
the future.
10 years down the road, where are we going to be?
Well, 10 years down the road, my dream and my hope, and I really hope for my children and for the children of my friends, is that we will be able to live in a Europe better than the one we found, not a worse one. So I would like to see in 10 years' time what I call our condominium. You know, we are stuck in this place. We cannot really sail away and go to Canada or to other places. We are stuck in this condominium. It's beautiful. It has given us a lot of great things, cheap holidays, cheap telephone calls, a lot of great things. We've been traveling. We've been knowing each other better. There have been a lot of great things in this building. We can decide to bomb it and decide that it's not going to be good for us anymore. But we will still be living there, so we need to think about that. My idea, my hope, is that we will see that we are these people, these 30 tenants in this building, and we need to make it work better. And we need to work together to build something that is more functional, more modern, that it works better, in which the votes in the condominium are properly counted. There is not only the Germans on the roof terrace flat that are having all the say, that the Greek in the garden flat that keep having barbecues and burn the foundation should start behaving better, and that we all together, we can become stronger and better. And I think that this can happen if it wasn't only for the fact that, you know, already at the last election, the President of the Commission had a sort of mandate from the European Parliament. In 5 years, there will be another elections. We can address the democratic deficit. We can make sure that our Parliament representatives will vote for someone that would be a proper leader of the Commission and try to make it better. That's my hope.
Yeah. I was struck during my 5.5 years in Brussels, which took in probably the deepest moments of the Eurozone crisis, just how committed Europe's leaders and the European political establishment is to the European Union. Time and again, particularly in this country, writers would talk about 5 days to save the euro. If the euro fails, Europe fails. And for a period, I believe that too. But actually, over a period of time, I realized just how strong that commitment to the European project is. And therefore, I don't think that despite these successive waves of crisis, I don't think the European political establishment will row back from that. And after all, they can point, whatever your views about Brexit, to substantial successes. You look at those countries that were under communism, or like Greece and Spain were under dictatorship, and now are part of a European Union. So I think never underestimate the commitment to making the European Union work. But in the period that I have been following it most closely, yes, this is the moment of biggest crisis. And undoubtedly, we talk about terrorism, the refugees, the Eurozone unresolved. I would say that if we are to move forward, and I believe probably it'll happen to 10 years down the road, Europe's politicians need to be incredibly honest about what is happening. And I think if they are honest, then the project will prosper. But I think the worst thing in the circumstances which we find ourselves at the moment would be to not tell it how it is. And I think that's true of the refugee crisis, certainly was true of the Eurozone crisis. There has to be a kind of levelling with the voters. But I know during the Eurozone crisis there was a lot of talk about this is the defining moment for Europe. This is a much more serious time. The refugee crisis is much more dangerous to Europe than ever the Eurozone crisis was.
Well, I think that Leave will probably win in the forthcoming referendum, not least because I think Natalie's right and Obama will intervene, which I think will be very helpful to the Leave side, unless Obama accompanies his urging us to remain in the EU with a proposal to extend freedom of movement to the people of Mexico in America, which I don't think he will. He'll look a bit hypocritical, and I don't think that'll be a helpful intervention for the Remainers. We know what Annalisa thinks the consequence of Britain leaving the European Union will be, because she wrote and directed a film about it called The Great European Disaster Movie, and everything absolutely falls apart, triggered by the catastrophic event of Britain's departure, including, I think, if I've got this right, I think the Russians invade Vienna. Anyway, I don't think that'll happen. I think
sadly was the ISIS striking Vienna, and it was done 1 year ago, and actually ISIS struck Paris, I think.
But you had the whole of Europe descending into a kind of economic conflict-strewn chaos as a result of the domino effect of Britain's departure, which I don't think is likely. I think it may be. I think it may be that it does stimulate other independence movements in other European countries, and it may be that this is the vital push that actually does result in some genuine reform within the European Union, and I hope that that reform takes the form of the European Union becoming much more like what it was in 1975 when we were asked whether we wanted to join it originally, which is a kind of glorified trade association. And Joris is, of course, right. You can't have a working single market without some pooling of sovereignty. But I think much more attractive European Union will be one which only required the different member states to pool just that sovereignty that was necessary to make the single market function well. And I don't think that requires freedom of movement. It doesn't require our putting ourselves under the jurisdiction of a single court, or in fact 2 warring courts, one in Luxembourg and one in Strasbourg and so forth. So I hope, and I don't agree, that we'll become a kind of irrelevant, declining economic power stranded in the middle of the Atlantic. If we do leave the European Union, I think we'll become the centre of a nexus of trading relationships which will be free to negotiate ourselves, not just with the EU, but with the Commonwealth and with America and South America as well. And I see Britain overtaking both Germany and Japan to become the 3rd largest economy, perhaps not in the next 10 years, but I think certainly within the next 25 years, provided we leave the European Union.
It's a complete
Natalie.
fantasy.
I think it's very revealing that you said Obama may come to this country and say stay in the EU, but then he would have to open up the border with Mexico. Is that what you're saying?
If he wasn't too hypocritical, because the Americans have never pooled sovereignty in their more than 200-year history.
I think that illustrates perfectly how you completely either ignore or distort what the reality is of the EU. Britain controls its borders. It will not more control its borders right now if you're talking about migrants if it pulls out of the EU. That is
yes, it will.
No,
because the default position won't be to let anyone into the UK who has a European passport.
Natalie, we would talk about sort of 10. Yeah, we've sort of moved off slightly. Your vision for 10 years down the road.
I think basically what this has really revealed is how some of the basic facts are just not known. And I think we shouldn't give up on spreading basic information and correct information. But what I do think about the future of the EU is I think it will pull through. I don't see it breaking up, disappearing. I think there are enough people in Europe who are aware of the fact that we live in a globalized world, that we can only defend our interests if we act as a collective club and not as individual nations. We won't draw any interest from any other major actors in the world, be it on trade, on security, on climate, on any things, if we break our continent up into little small pieces. I think you have to think about that. Europe does not have the influence. Big European nation states do not have the influence that they used to have in the past, and we have to think collectively if we want to try to shape realities, the realities that affect us, and not just be submitted to them. And I think if that vision has any hope of actually being upheld, I think it will depend to a large extent on what happens in our different countries on the political level. How do we address the question of populist narratives? What Europe is most threatened by right now is, you said it, Gavin, it's the migrant crisis. But why? Why does the migrant crisis represent such a threat? It's not because of the numbers. Look at this. The migrants that came to Europe in 2015 are 1.2 million people. That's slightly over 0.2% of the overall population of the EU. The reason why we didn't deal with this effectively is that we all scrambled with different solutions. People didn't agree on how to collectively deal with this, and so it turned into this wide mess of borders coming up, and the populists took advantage of this. And I think it's the growth of these populist narratives, these xenophobic, authoritarian narratives, which are the main threat to the European project. And that's why we have to address those narratives within our different countries, because that's where the political debate is mostly focused right now.
Right, I can do it. You've had your hand up, I know, for, you say 6 times. Do you have a very, very quick question? I can't guarantee it will be answered.
An American voice here, don't you think?
Okay, well, okay, very quickly, and then I know that we're going to get an American voice.
I've actually been asked to make a point as well as ask a question. Your comment about the British puerile press. We have on the stage here somebody who ought to be more open to the people of this and to the free speech environment of this panel. Today you launched in your pages the most puerile, bigoted attack. We Americans constantly look to Europe as unable to get over its ideological problems and its bigotry. And Clinton held back for a very long time, attacking. We hoped Europe would solve the Milosevic wars. Well, my first point is that I think you ought to apologize, and you ought to offer a right of reply of the management of this club for what you did today.
Okay, that's a somewhat separate issue.
The question is, fast forward to war. The question of Brexit is completely fatuous. I mean, we have candidates running in the American election talking about Article 5 of NATO. You've got a war going on. We have asymmetrical warfare. It hasn't been resolved yet how to deal with it. Europe, America, we're even dealing with Russia now that we are slamming in Ukraine just recently. England can't go in or out. It's part of the strategic balances, and the strategic balances now incorporate extremely difficult war, which we're going to be fighting for perhaps a century. So the whole question of leaving or staying in is completely fatuous at this point. I'm sure even Cameron, in his moments of sleep, is wondering why the hell he launched this thing, which is going to cause him a lot of embarrassment and will mean nothing a year from now.
Well, we know he's gone away to have a think, so I think that brings it to a close. You can see how hotly debated this argument is, and the stresses and strains on everybody's faces. But I'd like to thank Natalie, Toby, Annalisa, and Joris. Thank you very much for a very entertaining debate.